Every family turned away the young woman, with a wine-colored birthmark on her face. The morning I found her, she was sitting on the loading dock behind Harlan's feed with her back to the wall, and her knees pulled up against her chest like she was trying to take up less space than a person rightfully takes. She had a canvas bag beside her, small enough that whatever she owned fit in it with room to spare. The stain went from her left cheekbone down past her jaw, port wine, the color of a bruise that never healed. She was watching the alley like she expected something to come down it. I had the wagon already loaded. I could have driven on. I stood there long enough that she looked up at me, and I could see she was waiting for whatever face I was going to make. I've watched people do that to her since. That pause, that bracing. She'd learned to wait for it because it always came. "I'm Caleb Drum," I said. "I run the drum spread north of town. I'm heading out now if you need a ride." She looked at me a long time without saying anything. "That's all right too," I said, and walked around to climb up on the seat. She came around the other side and sat down 6 inches from the edge, her bag on her lap. Her name was Wren Calloway. She told me that about a mile out, just the name, nothing else. I told her the road would be rough for about 3 miles until we reached the cutoff, and after that it smoothed out. She nodded and we didn't say much else for a while. "I need to tell you something about the land first, because the land is where this happened, and you don't understand a man without understanding what he built. 31 years I'd had that valley. I came to it when it was nothing. I mean nothing. I mean raw ground and the bones of one burned house the previous family left when the first hard winter took them. I built the main house with 2 hired hands, and I built the barn the year after, and I built the fence line the year after that, post by post, 2 miles of it, and then another 2, corner to corner across the north pasture. My wife Clara, she came in the 4th year. She saw something in that land she liked. She saw something in me she liked too, though I couldn't tell you what it was. We had 11 good years before the sickness took her. After that I kept going because I didn't know how not to. You get a property that size going, and it has its own momentum, and you either follow it or you stop dead. My son Eli left for Colorado at 22, said there was silver up there with his name on it. Maybe there was. He sent a letter maybe twice a year, then once, then not at all. I had a cook, Marta, who came 2 days a week, and 2 hands, Duffy, and a boy called Patch, and after Clara that was the whole of my world. 61 years old that spring. The kind of man who rides 3 sections of fence before breakfast, not because he enjoys it, but because it needs riding. The kind who doesn't sit down until the day is done and doesn't talk much when he does. I wasn't lonely exactly. I knew what I was. I'd made my choices, and here was the life they'd earned me, and that seemed fair. She didn't explain herself that first day, and I didn't press. I showed her the bunkhouse Duffy and Patch slept in the West End, and said there was a corner with a curtain hung up that had been empty since the previous hand quit. Not much, but it had a cot and a window, and the window faced east. She set her bag down and looked around it without expression. "I'll work for my keep," she said. It was the most she'd said since she'd given me her name. I told her Marta could use the help on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the chickens wanted looking after, and there was plenty else if she wanted it. She looked at me again with that measuring look, and I recognized it for what it was later. She was trying to figure out what I wanted from her, what this was going to cost. "It's not going to cost you anything," I said, and I walked back to the house. I didn't know at the time why I'd said it that plainly. I think now I said it because I'd known enough people in my life who'd been sized up and found lacking for reasons that weren't their fault. Clara had a limp the last 3 years from a fall, and I watched men treat her different for it. I knew what that does to a person. Wren Calloway sat down on that cot that first night, and I don't imagine she slept much. But by morning she was up before Marta arrived and had the chicken coop cleaned out and the water buckets run up from the creek. The trouble started inside of a week. Town was 9 miles. I went on Saturdays for the mail and supplies. The third Saturday after she came, I asked her if she needed anything from town, and she looked at me with something strange in her face and said, "I don't go to town." I thought she meant she didn't want to come along. Later, Duffy told me what had happened. She'd walked in herself on a Wednesday. She hadn't asked me, just walked the 9 miles in, bought thread and 2 envelopes. Came back 9 miles. Duffy said she didn't tell him what happened, but her face was different when she got back. He said the look on her wasn't sad exactly. It was the look of a person who'd had a thing confirmed that they already knew was true. I asked him if he had any idea what was said to her in town. He looked at his boots. Some things got said, he told me, at the dry goods, at the street. Duffy was a decent man, but he was also a man who knew when something was above his station to get in the middle of. I went in the next Saturday alone. I didn't say anything to anybody. I just went to the dry goods and ordered what I needed, and when Varner behind the counter asked me in that casual way how things were up at the drum place, whether I had some kind of situation up there, I looked at him for a moment and then I said, "I have a hired girl working the property and she's very good at her job, and I don't recall asking for your opinion of it." Varner didn't say anything else. I wasn't angry exactly, I just wanted it settled. What I'm telling you isn't a story about me riding in and fixing everything. I want to be honest about that because it matters. Some things I could fix, some I couldn't. The Reardon family, they had the next spread east, about 6 miles. They came by in June for the annual ride-through we'd done every few years, checking the boundary fences, keeping things neighborly. Walt Reardon and his 2 boys. They sat their horses at the gate and I came out and we talked, and Walt saw Wren crossing the yard and he didn't say anything, just watched her with a face like he'd smelled something. His boys were less careful. The younger one said something to the older one behind his hand, and both of them grinned. I asked Walt if he was coming in. He said he thought maybe they'd ride the fence some other time. I said, "Suit yourself," and walked back to the house. That night I sat on the porch for a long time. I won't say I didn't care what the Reardons thought. I won't pretend I was above that. They were neighbors, and you need neighbors in that country, and I sat there chewing on the whole thing. But when I finally went inside and thought it through to the other end of it, the only other end was, ask her to leave, or ask her to make herself small enough that men like Walt Reardon could pretend she wasn't there. I'd done that once already, with Clara and her limp. I'd let her see me flinch when Harlan's wife made that small, careful remark about the struggle of getting around. Not much of a flinch, but she'd seen it. She never said anything, but I knew she saw it. That was one of my regrets. I wasn't going to do it again. Summer came hard that year. Dry and windburned, the kind that cracks the soil open and turns the creek down to a thread. We were out on the north pasture 6 days running, moving the herd to where there was still some grazing. Wren came out on the 3rd day with the noon meal packed in a canvas sack, biscuits, dried beef, a canteen. She'd ridden Marta's old mare, the one with the white blaze. She sat with us while we ate, off to one side a little, and I noticed Duffy talked to her straight, the way you talk to somebody who's just there working alongside you. Patch was 18 and too young to be careful about other people's opinions of other people, so he was easy. I was grateful for that. On the way back she rode beside me for a stretch and said she'd noticed the east fence post at the creek crossing was heeled over. She said it like she was reporting on a chicken or a supply count. Matter of fact. I went and looked at it the next morning. She was right. The post had rot below the soil line and one good frost would drop it. I reset it myself that afternoon. I don't know exactly when I started noticing her as more than just a person I'd taken on. It isn't something I want to explain too carefully because it isn't the kind of thing that explains cleanly. I'm 61 years old and I had Clara, and I knew what a good woman looked like and what she felt like to be around, and I recognized that Wren Calloway was one. She was 29. She had a quickness to her, not fast talking. She didn't talk fast, but a quickness of attention. The way she noticed things. That fence post. The way the lame calf was favoring its right foreleg 6 hours before it was obvious. She'd mention these things in the same voice she'd say the water bucket needed refilling, and it took me a while to understand that she wasn't showing off. She was just attending to things. She had a habit of reading in the evenings, whatever she could borrow from the shelves in the house. She'd ask first always. One evening I came in from late work and she was at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, and she was deep in one of Clara's herbals. Clara had been a healer of a sort, new plants, and she didn't look up right away. And in that moment before she knew I was there, I saw her just as herself. A woman at a table reading about plants in the lamplight. And I thought, she should have this all the time. She should have a table and a lamp and books, and nobody making her feel like she has to justify her face. I went back outside for a while before I came back in. There was a night in August. The Hands were in town for the Saturday. I'd given them the night, and Marta wasn't there, and it was just the two of us. We'd been working the south pasture in the heat all day, and Wren had been good for the work, tireless and quiet the way she was. After supper she asked me, out of nothing, how long I'd had the valley. 31 years, I said. She looked around the kitchen, Clara's curtain still on the window, Clara's iron pot on the stove, and she said, it shows. I asked her what she meant. She said, you can tell when a man has put himself into land. It feels lived in. Some places just feel managed. This feels like yours. I didn't know what to do with that for a moment. Nobody had said anything like that to me in a long time. Maybe ever in quite that way, not complimenting the place, complimenting what a man had given to it. I said, Clara helped make it what it is. She nodded. She looked at the curtains and then back at her coffee. She sounds like she was a good woman, she said. She was, I said. We sat a while longer. I want to tell you I said something right then. I didn't. I'm not a man who says the right thing in the moment. I sat there with my coffee getting cold and she sat with hers, and the lamp burned between us, and outside the nighthawks were going. It was enough. In some ways it was more than enough. The real trouble came in September. There was a man named Cord Pruitt. He had a small place about 4 miles west, not much of a ranch, more of a claim. He'd had his eye on my west water rights for a couple of years, and he hadn't gotten anywhere with me by the straight road, so he was trying other approaches. He'd been working Walt Reardon, I knew that. He'd been talking to the county man who passed through twice a year. He came riding in on a Tuesday. Wren was in the yard. I was in the barn when I heard the hooves, and when I came out, he was sitting his horse in the yard looking down at her, and she was standing with a feed bucket and looking back up at him without moving. He said something I didn't catch. I walked over and said, Cord. He looked at me and smiled, that smile men like that have, like they know something you don't. He said, just getting acquainted with your people, Caleb. I said, you can acquaint yourself with me. Step down or ride on. He stayed on his horse for a moment, making me wait for it, and then he said, seems like a man your age oughtn't to be too particular about the company he keeps. Town's talking, Caleb. I said, town can talk all it wants. He looked at Wren again and then back at me, and he said, it ain't healthy. What I'm saying is, it ain't healthy for a man in your position to make enemies over something like this. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, Cord, you came onto my property to threaten me about the girl I've hired to work it. I'm asking you one time to ride on. He tried to hold the smile, but it went a little thin at the edges. He said, just trying to help. I said, I know what you're trying to do, and I want you to understand something. Those water rights aren't for sale last year, this year, or any year. And whatever you've got working with Reardon or the county man isn't going to come to anything. And when you ride back into town today, you can tell people that Caleb Drum asked me to carry that exact message. He looked at me for a long time, trying to read whether I meant it. I'd been running this land for 31 years. I meant every word of it. He rode out. Wren hadn't moved during any of it. When his horse cleared the gate, she set the feed bucket down and looked at me, and I couldn't quite read her face. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something older and quieter than gratitude. She said, "That's going to make things worse for you." I said, "Probably." She said, "I didn't ask you to do that." I said, "No. You didn't." She picked up the bucket and went back to the chickens. It did make things worse for a while. Reardon came by with a county notice about a water survey that was clearly Prewitt's hand at work. I had a lawyer in the county seat, a man named Galt who'd handled Clara's estate, and I wrote him a letter and he wrote back that the survey was groundless and he'd answer it accordingly. That cost money. Everything costs money. The town didn't warm up. I went in and I got what I needed and people were careful around me, and I was careful back, and we got along the way you get along when no one is exactly friends. What I noticed was this: Wren didn't ask me about any of it. She didn't ask whether I regretted it. She didn't ask whether I wanted her to go. She just worked. She was up before me, and sometimes she was still going when I'd already given up for the night. She started mending the harness when she saw it was cracked and didn't mention she'd done it. She rerouted the drainage ditch behind the barn after a week of rain, and when I found the work done, I stood there for a moment just looking at it, because it was exactly the right fix, and I'd been meaning to do it myself for 2 seasons. I said, "You didn't have to do that." She said it needed doing. That was Wren. October came and the air turned. I'd been running harder than I had in years, getting the herd sorted before the weather came, getting the south pasture cut, getting the stores in. I was tired the way you're tired when you're 61 and not 25, in your joints and not just your muscles, the kind of tired that sits down into you. One afternoon I was coming back from the north pasture, and my horse put a foot wrong in a gopher hole and went down, and I went over his head and hit the ground hard. Not badly. Nothing broken that I knew of, but I lay there for a moment with the wind out of me and the cold ground against my back, and I thought about how the world looks when you're flat in a field with the sky very large above you. I got up, walked the horse back. Duffy saw me limping and said, "Boss." I said, "Fine." I wasn't fine. By evening my ribs had stiffened up on the right side and my shoulder was a knot of something wrong. I didn't say anything. I ate at the table and Wren was there, and she watched me cut my meat once and didn't say anything then either. Later that night she knocked at the door of the room I used for the office. I'd been trying to look at the account books, which was a joke in my condition, and she came in with a cloth and a tin of salve that had Clara's handwriting on it. She'd found it in the herbals. She said, "Which ribs?" I said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "Which ribs?" I showed her and she looked at me with that level eye, and then she stood behind me and worked that salve into the muscle along the ribs with her hands, careful and firm, and the pain went from a constant thing to something that existed and also could be breathed around. She didn't say anything while she did it. I didn't say anything. When she was done, she came around in front of me and held the tin out and said, "Twice a day for a week or you'll seize up by November." She was close. The lamp was over my shoulder and it caught the wine stain on her face and caught the rest of her face too, the way she was watching me, not with pity but with something solid and certain, like she'd made up her mind about something and she was comfortable in it. I said, "Wren." She said, "Don't." I said, "I'm not doing what you think I'm doing." She waited. I said, "I want to say that you are one of the finest people who has ever worked this land, and I know that's not very much to say to someone who is more than a hired hand." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "You went out there and stood up to Prewitt because you thought it was right." I said it was right. She said, "Nobody has ever done that for me, without asking first what it was going to cost them." I said, "I know what it cost. It cost what it cost." She didn't look away. That wine stain and the rest of her face and those careful, quiet eyes, and she was looking at me like I was something solid that she was choosing to lean on. And I knew the weight of that because it was a real weight and she was giving it freely. She set her hand against the side of my face, just flat against my jaw, the way you'd steady something you didn't want to fall. I put my hand over hers. We stayed that way for a while. I'll tell you the rest in pieces, because that's how it happened. Galt won the water survey. Took until February, but he won it. Prejudice sold his claim in the spring and moved north toward Wyoming, or that's what I heard. The Reardons came around slowly. Not all the way. Walt Reardon had a way of looking past Wren when he talked that he never entirely lost. But he came. Men like that, they follow the hardest man in the room, and by then everybody in that valley knew I was still standing and I wasn't moving, and so they followed. Marta, who'd been neutral through all of it, took to Wren sometime in the winter. I don't know exactly when. I came into the kitchen one Tuesday and they were talking about a plant, something in Clara's herbals, some use of it Marta's mother had known, and laughing a little, and I backed out again because some things you don't walk into. Eli wrote in March. He was coming home for a visit. He arrived in April and met Wren and sat across the table from her at supper and talked to her the whole time about nothing in particular: horses, the soil, whether the East Creek had changed course since he'd left, and when he left he shook her hand and said, "Good to know the place is in good hands." She watched him ride out and then looked at me, and one side of her mouth went up. We married in June, small. Galt witnessed it, and Marta and Duffy and Patch. I'm not going to tell you it was easy after that, because nothing about life in that country is easy. The land takes what it takes, and you give what you have, and some years you come out ahead, and some years you don't. The summer of the following year was the worst drought in memory, and we lost a third of the herd, and I sat on the porch one August evening with the accounts in my head, and it was ugly math. She came and sat beside me. She didn't ask about the math. She just sat down in the other chair and folded her hands on her knee and was there. I said, "It's going to be lean." She said, "We've been lean before." I said, "You've only been here a year." She said, "I know this place. I know what it can do." I looked at her and I believed her. She knew every fence line on the property, every gopher hole in the north pasture, every plant in Clara's herbals and a few that weren't. She knew the sound the barn door made before rain because the wood swelled. She knew this place because she'd put herself into it the same way I had, the way you do when a thing is yours. That was the word, hers. 31 years I built this valley before she came. I built it alone after Clara died, and I kept it going because that's what you do with something you've built. But I'll tell you something honest. For all those years after Clara, I was the only one it belonged to, and that is a lonelier kind of ownership than I like to admit. When Wren sat down in that chair and said, "We've been lean before," I felt it in the way you feel things you don't have words good enough for. Not relief. Something steadier than relief. Like a post that's been standing in wet ground finally hitting the dry rock underneath. You want to know what this valley looks like now? It looks the same. Same fence lines, same barn, same creek going down to thread in dry years. The house has a new window on the east side that she wanted and I put in last fall, and the kitchen garden is larger than it was because she knows more about plants than I ever will. The hands changed over, Duffy moved on, new men came, they all treated her the way she was treated here, and after a while that was just how it was. She's standing in that kitchen right now. I can hear her moving. The wood floor has a creak in the middle she's learned to step around, but sometimes she still hits it and it makes that sound, and when I hear it from out here I know where she is. That's a small thing. I don't know why it matters so much. It does though. 62 years old and this valley is mine the way it never quite was before. Not because anything changed about the land. Because the right person chose to stay in it and call it hers too. And when a good woman makes that choice, eyes open, knowing what it costs, You'd have to be a fool not to understand what that's worth. I'm not a fool. The light's going down now behind the west pasture, that particular color of October going orange and flat. She'll call me in soon. There'll be supper and the lamp, and the sound of that floorboard and all the ordinary things this life is made of, and I'm going to walk back inside to it without looking over my shoulder. Not one thing left to prove to anybody. That's enough, that's more than enough.